Welcome back to another episode of the Social Web TV, the internet TV show that answers the question, who owns your data, with these two simple words, you do. Yes, and we're back from vacation. I hope you were able to survive 1 week without us.
We're well rested. I hope you are.
Look at my tan. All right, tropical storm.
It's a brown
right?
shirt.
So, long story.
Yeah.
So there are some things in the news this week, but today we're going to primarily focus on one of the key building blocks. We talked a few weeks ago about open specs as key building blocks for the next phase of the web. So we'll focus mostly on OAuth, but before we get there, what's in the news, guys?
So this week, Mixi, which is the largest social network in Japan, about 1 in 5 web users in Japan use Mixi.
That's crazy. That's like it's like Orchid for Japan, right? It's like
Exactly, but in Japanese.
Not
Okay.
yeah.
Brazilian.
Yeah.
That's my joke, sorry.
They released support for OpenID 2.0 this week, so that every Mixi account is also an OpenID, which is what a few of the larger providers have done. But what they did differently was that they actually supported the ability to exchange profile information over OpenID as well. So they're using the OpenID simple registration extension, so that when a Mixi user signs into a site using their OpenID, the site can request things like their profile, like their name from their profile.
Or photo or.
Yeah,
All that information
I think it's
is
limited
easier.
right now a little bit,
But
but
just the kind of classic information you always have to enter in from scratch, where it's like, oh, here I've already got an account. Let me just show you who I am, right? It
Yeah,
is-
exactly.
If you think about that OpenID experience, that being able to pull that profile
yeah, and
info
they're
is-
the first large
piece of
provider to go and do this. I mean, Yahoo has OpenID support for all of their users, but decided not to exchange any profile information so far. So I think it's really cool to see what Mixi's doing. And then they've also made it so that you could easily choose to have your site only accept OpenID logins from your friends on Mixi. So being able to do some of these social elements as well
really
that
cool.
you started to see in things like Facebook Connect. ReadWrite Web wrote about this and sort of asking that question, how much longer can Facebook hold out not doing these sorts of things on open specifications? When you start to get examples like Mixi going and shipping it, MySpace, when we interviewed Alan
Right.
Herf a few weeks ago, talking about building these same sorts of experiences using open technologies. So that's really cool to see.
All right. What else in the news?
I guess also in OpenID news, there was that nice post on Mashable of a whole bunch of different things you can do with OpenID, a big list of sites supporting OpenID, sites consuming OpenID, resources for people building OpenID, and
Including a link to your
OpenID recipe
recipe.
guide. Yeah, that's right, which came out of us implementing OpenID for Plaxo. And so that it's just great to see again how far that's really come and how much momentum continues to build. And
Actually, on that point, I'd like to sort of give a shout out to Get Satisfaction, which recently implemented OpenID.
that's great.
There's a site called Demand OpenID, which is demand.openid.net, and they had about 212 requests actually for OpenID there. And that was another sort of success story where we worked with them, talked to them, and worked them through the process. And so that's another
I
good.
guess it's kind of fitting that a site
Yeah.
that's all about responding to customer demands
right.
would respond to their own customer demands. So
Imagine that.
Yeah.
good for you.
All right, cool. So now let's dive into one of the key building blocks, OAuth.
Oh, I guess before that, one
Yeah.
other thing worth pointing out, Friendster went live with their
right.
open social
Yeah. Oh,
implementation. So another 75 million users thrown on the pile there, which is pretty nice to see.
Yeah, I think it's up to about 350 million users.
Thrown on the pile.
Now using
Right.
open social.
Yeah, well,
Sorry.
that now can use OpenSocial across
Yeah.
a few different networks. I mean, OpenSocial is less than a year old at this point.
Yeah.
And getting to that point of sort of really starting to get to critical adoption across lots of different social networks.
And for folks who haven't followed all of the details, what this means is if you're a developer of social applications or widgets that you want to have played out inside a social network, you can now write to this one platform and know that it will run now across several large sites, including Friendster.
MySpace, High Five.
Sort of. A little bit of
Orchid,
tweaks here and
Yeah.
there,
But certainly
basically-
for the
most
most
part,
part,
better than
starting
what
over from
we had
scratch.
before.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I guess since we'll be talking about OAuth, it's cool to point out that the latest version of OpenSocial also uses OAuth in their APIs as the way that you can give access to that private information. So these are all sort of playing together in a complementary way.
All right, so OAuth, we have probably talked about it a little bit in several shows, but let's not assume that people know what it is. And Chris, you've played a really key role in getting this building block to come about through a kind of community process. So
Sure.
why don't you tell us what it is first, and then we'll get into how it came about.
Sure. So OAuth basically is a way of we're using sort of the shorthand that it's a valet key for the web. Essentially, valet key with a car kind of gives some other driver the ability to drive the car maybe 15 miles an hour and within a couple mile radius or whatever, but doesn't give them the full access to drive the car, on the highway 90 miles
Open
an
the
hour.
trunk,
Open
what
the
have you.
trunk,
Yeah.
all those different things. So it's kind of limited access to the full use of, in this case, your data. So the idea really is around defeating what we've called so far the password anti-pattern, which essentially is where some third-party site, which you may or may not trust, asks for your actual username and password or your email address and password to access your data from some other site. And you see this a lot when various social networks ask to import your address book, and they of course ask for your full credentials, which allow them to access everything as opposed to just a very limited subset. So what's nice about OAuth, and the auth actually stands for authorization, as in giving permission, is really around assigning limited permissions to different third-party services to access some subset of your information, that's scoped, I guess is a good way to say it. The need for OAuth sort of came out of, sort of going back last, it was last spring, I guess, or something like that. It's been a little while now, but essentially trying to figure out a way of using OpenID actually in dashboard widgets, like Apple dashboard widgets, which traditionally only use the username and password, and also getting Twitter to adopt OpenID. Now, that hasn't exactly happened yet, but it did reveal a need for this type of API, and what we did was we sort of looked across the web and realized that Google, AOL, Yahoo, Microsoft, all these different large providers,
Facebook, Flickr,
Amazon.
everybody basically had their own version of the same sort of protocol.
I mean, all those guys have had that same problem of like, we do want our users to be able to use their account across the web in
To make
some
it more
way,
useful.
Right.
but it's sort of scary and dangerous to give out your username and password and
Yeah.
hope that the site doesn't do something malicious or even just inadvertently cause some problems when really you as a user want to be able to say, here, just go have this information. Or if you change your mind and decide you don't want to use that service later, you don't want to have to change your password everywhere just to lock out the other sites. So,
Well, and one of the problems that all of these companies were running into with their own version of the way to do this is that developers wouldn't actually implement against them. It was easier for developers to just go and ask for usernames
Right.
and passwords, because if they wanted to interact even with Flickr and Yahoo, both of which, are Yahoo, they had to go and write different code.
Right.
And so that was one of the real drivers, I
pain
think, both a pain point and then reason that a lot of these companies got involved in helping to create and shape OAuth was that they saw it was the ability to have more developers stop to request passwords instead of continuing to do it differently.
And I think that's a common recipe for a lot of these building blocks that you sort of look for, is that it's a common problem that users and sites have, and lots of people have independently realized this and kind of each built their own solution for it, and that's not really helping anybody. It's not really like Amazon's authorization version versus Flickr's authorization version is like some sort of competitive advantage or some sort of secret sauce. It's just a necessary thing you have to do so that people can use your service. And so when you see that pattern of lots of people solving the same thing in different ways and kind of everybody losing, there's been I think a couple of cases now, and it's getting better, of communities step in and say, hey guys, let's all get together, let's sort of agree on one version of it that's not necessarily that much better than any of the others, but it's one we can all agree on. We can get code working in lots of different languages so developers can just drop it in and not have to develop it from scratch. We can make sure it works really well. And then we can all sort of build on top of that ecosystem. And I think OAuth is a great modern example of that happening.
I think we saw that same sort of thing with OpenID and OpenSocial as well. They probably did
Exactly.
it a little bit before it was a common problem for everyone, but especially with OpenSocial, it was a group of social networks predicting that they're each going to go and create their own version of a platform, and instead figuring out how to work together to try to standardize a lot of that.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think one of the major differences and sort of learning things that we take from OAuth really is looking at how, again, sort of smaller networks, smaller web services, Twitter, Magnolia, Pounce, those guys kind of came together initially to have a conversation about their need for these types of protocols. They weren't at the scale of Yahoo or Microsoft or whomever, and decided, well, we all have this common problem. Let's figure out how to do this for ourselves. So it's very real. It's something that we actually need to solve. It's not sort of some academic thing. We're all going to do it ourselves anyways. Why don't we come together around this? But let's look at existing work that's already been done out there, and let's see what we can learn.
Right.
And obviously the smaller companies have a lot to gain by participating in this. What was your experience with OAuth and getting some of the larger players to get involved in the project and become supporters?
I think it was a really, really fascinating experience since, coming from the microformats community where we sort of go along the idea of paving cow paths of, what work has already been done rather than inventing from scratch. In this case, we did start with a smaller number of companies. We sort of like started with a closed mailing list just to make sure that the conversations were focused. We got to a certain point, and it was around this time that John Panzer, who was first at AOL and then at Google, and then Aaron Hammer kind of came into the project and sort of started socializing it. And DeWitt was also around at that point.
Also from Google.
Yeah, also from Google. Sort of like started realizing, hey, there might really be something here. We realize the problem. We think, or now this is what they've never said this, but this is the politics of how these things sort of work, is that Yahoo would probably never adopt Google's API and Google wouldn't adopt Microsoft's and so on and so forth. So it kind of became this neutral Switzerland of a protocol in a sense, where a number of these vendors could come together and say, well, we realize the value of this. We realize we want to lower the cost for doing this the right way.
Yeah.
No one's going to implement support for all of our APIs, and so they're going to continue doing the scraping and asking for people's passwords, which is a really bad security situation.
Yeah.
So let's let this small group of people sort of usher this thing forward, learn from all the stuff and investment we've already made, and then kind of come up with that standardization or that convention that the rest of us can then adopt and move forward. And so I think part of it was having a very clear focus and solving a very explicit problem that everyone sort of already agreed upon existed, and realizing that, as Joseph said, there was really no competitive advantage to maintaining their own proprietary version of the protocol.
And Google was really supportive through this
Absolutely.
entire process. I mean, really involved in helping to write OAuth, refine OAuth, think about security around OAuth. And then, I mean, since then...
And Yahoo's actually been a really good participant.
Yeah.
I mean, like all these different companies actually have been.
It's such a great feedback cycle. I mean, seeing from my perspective of, you have these large companies, you have small companies, you have grassroots people, and they've each kind of got their own perspective and their own set of priorities, right? But certainly, if we want this stuff to all be adopted so that real mainstream users can take advantage of everywhere they go, getting it out there is sort of the number one thing to be done. And so to have that feedback from these big companies with that pragmatic attitude of, okay, we want to help get it out there. We've got, as a big company, the following privacy concerns, the following big technical scalability concerns, that sort of thing. And let's just have that dialogue and figure out how to come to the right conclusion so we can get this done. Like same thing with OpenID. Like that's how you solve it and how you really get it out to the end of the world. And it's so great, I think, to be in a place like Silicon Valley where we really are kind of all in the same place, and we've got passionate engineers and product people at each of these companies who can come together and find that common ground and then go work with each their own organizations to figure out how to actually get it done, and on a pretty aggressive time schedule too.
Yeah. Well, and then also that being some of the force behind the Open Web Foundation of how can we go and take the lessons learned from things like microformats and OpenID and OpenSocial and OAuth and a lot of the work that's been happening in things like the Dojo toolkit and Gears
and Apache before that.
I mean Apache for source code before that versus specifications, and go and really create a process and an organization where future groups, whether they be in the Valley or out of the Valley or whatever they want to work on related to the open web, can really take advantage of all of sort of the knowledge that a group of us have and have sort of refined a few times in doing this.
No, I think it's important to look at the adoption so far too, though.
Right.
I mean, to look at how Google has actually adopted OAuth as sort of a centerpiece of OpenSocial.
You can now access any Google API
Yeah.
using
Yeah.
OAuth instead, in addition to Google's proprietary auth.
Yeah, all of the
system.
GA APIs.
So since not everyone in the audience is a developer, but the idea here, I think, is really mainstream consumer benefit. What would be examples where people could go today, point their browser somewhere, and actually encounter OAuth experience in the wild?
Probably one of the best places to go right now where there's actually a really good implementation is FireEagle, and that's a Yahoo property that allows you to record your location. They've done a really good job both with the design and with explaining what's going on. And essentially what it will allow you to do is with a site like Brightkite, for example, which is a location-based service again, to take your Brightkite account, to be logged into Brightkite, and to click a link that takes you over to the FireEagle site, and then to allow FireEagle either to record or set your location. I think it's to record your location at different levels of granularity. And then you're taken back to the Brightkite site where you can manage your access, essentially. So that's sort of like the round trip where you start at one place where you want to either provide access to data, that way, or push data out. You go to the other source. You sort of specify what information you want to make available, do you want to allow that, and so forth, and then you kind of come back and you can revoke that access later. And so
I mean, location information is, to me, a perfect example
Yeah.
of stuff that, A, I don't want to have to put where I am into, all the different applications I use. I want to be able to say it once.
Yeah.
And B, I obviously don't want everybody to know exactly where I am all the time, but I certainly want to be able to share that information with people that I want to share it with.
Yeah.
And so that pattern as a user of me saying, okay, I feel comfortable that I know which sites are knowing where I am and which sites are able to say where I am, and I'm comfortable I know who's seeing that. I'm going to end up using that in a lot more places, right?
I mean, all the Flickr uploaders work in in a very similar
Yep.
way as well. So whenever you kind of see the word like authorize or allow, that's kind of when you get the sense when you're actually interacting with one of these protocols or these APIs.
You're going over and logging in on the site that actually has your data, and you're saying, is it okay if this other site has access to it? And then you go back to them. That's that OAuth dance.
I've also seen, I think it might have been the case of Flickr, where if you're already signed in to the other site, like Gmail, it can be a really kind of magical experience.
Yeah, yeah.
Sort of like OpenID too, where you just sort of click and you're in because it remembered who you are.
Yeah.
So, we've
So
got-
it should actually end up not only more secure for users, but actually more user-friendly as well.
After that first hop, it's
Yeah.
amazing.
You set it up and then it just works.
Yeah.
So Google, Yahoo, MySpace has announced that they're doing stuff with it. We're shipping libraries in movable type.
Yep.
Who else?
We're working on plugins for WordPress right now through the Dizo project. There's a number of other folks who've
And
come
it's
on
it's
board
baked
lately.
into Open Social and Portable Contacts. It's sort of the standard way you access that information. So
That's right.
all of those other big players we talked about doing Open Social will presumably be.
And I know,
doing all
Joseph,
that.
you implemented it recently in order to interoperate with Google Friend Connect.
That's right. Yep, that's how Google
So
Friend
Pla-
Connect talks to
Plaxos,
Plaxo
yeah.
for that, and also using it for portable contacts. So
So having just recently implemented, a lot of work, little work.
it's good. And there's actually pretty good libraries out now in most of the popular languages. And really, all you have to do is just sort of follow step by step. Where do you generate and store the keys that you need to use? I think like all these things, it'll be even better when we have a better kind of step by step tutorial guides and really polished libraries in each language. And I encourage people who are passionate about this to get involved and help, because one little document or one little guide or one little tutorial can really make a big difference.
Yeah, the mailing list has been really good because it's not as straightforward as just accepting user credentials, but it's a much better sort of pattern that I think developers will start to get used to and see more frequently. And so there will be libraries that just kind of take care of this for you, where it becomes very simple.
And the other thing I think that's worth pointing out is, you can look at who's already shipped OAuth support, but I think the other thing you have to look at is who's no longer inventing yet another authorization pattern. Because once OAuth is out there and it's understood that that kind of is the agreed upon standard, I've talked to lots of companies who have been rolling out their own APIs or wanting to do something in the sort of data portability space and have said, well, we're still in the planning phase, but we at least know, good thing we don't have to invent our own authorization scheme because OAuth is already out there. So let's assume we're going to have that as a building block. And that can be just as powerful, sort of like how Open Social, the code wasn't all out when it was announced, but at least people saw that and said, okay, good, there's a building block there. I'm not going to try to reinvent it for myself. And that sort of ability to stop the fragmentation is, I think, also very important. And we're certainly seeing that with OAuth.
And something that's true for all the building blocks.
Yep.
Yep. And so I think OAuth, clearly one of the key building blocks. We talk about this OpenStack, OpenID, OAuth, and more to come, like portable contacts. We've run out of time for today, but I hope you learned something from the show. Tune in next week. We're going to have a special guest because it's the 1 week anniversary of the
Year anniversary.
1 year anniversary.
Internet does move fast.
Not that fast. 1 year anniversary of the Bill of Rights for Users of the Social Web, co-authored by Joseph Smar, Mark Cantor, Robert Scoble, and Michael Arrington. So we hope to have Mark Cantor on as a special guest. All right, so tune in next week for another episode of The Social Web TV.